An example, perhaps, is that you've heard about the names of different kings of England, or you've heard of battles that Spain was in, or something, and they just go in one ear and right out the other until you find out some fascinating fact about the history of Britain or Spain that awakens your interest in the subject, and the next time you hear this stuff, it sticks much more readily to your mind. These things can pass, like I said, right through your head, in one ear and out the other, and then the exact same fact or idea, months or years later, will be powerful and cogent for you, just because of your change of context or because of a personal experience. Interesting point he raises there. The fatal tendency of mankind to leave off thinking about a thing when it is no longer doubtful is the cause of half of their errors. A contemporary author has well spoken of the deep slumber of a decided opinion. So once we all know something, we don't have to talk about it or debate it anymore. I think this is part of what's happening today with Einstein's relativity. It was proven so obviously true that no one has it in them to question it. Now, to be fair, I watched a documentary, not a documentary, a lecture by a professor from University of California. It's on UC Television YouTube channel. And he says if you read certain websites, you'll find that people think that there's a modern conspiracy against non-Einsteinian theories. And he asserts that it's not quite true, that he says each one of us scientists working in this field would love to be the first one to come up with an explanation of dark matter and dark energy and to correct gravity or to get the unified field theory in place or whatever. He says we would all love to be the first ones, but we have to stop just looking around and criticizing what's happening in science and go a step further and have a positive theory. And that's an interesting point, but as well-intentioned as he is in saying that, there is resistance to other theories. Monetary resistance, governmental resistance, inertia in the schools and colleges. So there is more resistance than he lets on to these types of ideas. Now he raises some interesting questions. To avoid this deep slumber of a decided idea, quote, is a proposition never thoroughly understood and felt unless some doubt of it remains? Is it the case that as soon as we all come to agree on it, all of a sudden it is no longer true in some sense? Or it's possibly not true, or becomes in the danger of losing its truthhood or value just because we all agree on it? Quote, I affirm no such thing. As mankind improve, the number of doctrines which are no longer disputed or doubted will be constantly on the increase, and the well-being of mankind may almost be measured by the number and gravity of the truths which have reached the point of being uncontested. Now, how should we teach things to youngsters who are coming up in the world? If we all agree on these things, how do we impart the knowledge to the youngsters? Like, for example, gravity. He says, quote, I should like to see the teachers of mankind endeavoring to provide a substitute for it, for just imparting the knowledge to kids and not questioning it. A substitute for some way, quote, some contrivance for making the difficulties of the question as present to the learner's consciousness as if they were present and pressed upon him by a dissentient champion, eager for his conversion. So, he says he would like it if people could learn these things, kids could learn these things, as if they were in the middle of the controversy itself, and as if the original controversy were raging right there as the child is learning it. Now, that's a lovely thought, and that is exactly the method that Lisa Van Dam uses in her school, and David Harriman in his science courses that he teaches in her school. And that is exactly the method that I try to use, emulating Lisa Van Dam and David Harriman and company. For example, when you're teaching gravity, you're teaching about Newton, and you're teaching inertia, you're teaching about Galileo, and these lessons are sort of together. I teach them over several days in a few lectures. Here's how I introduce the problem. I take a bucket of water with an inch or two of water and I say, can I put this upside down? And if I do, what will happen? And the kids all say, well, the water will come out. So then I take it and give it a couple of rocks back and forth until I can swing it all the way around. And what happens to the water? It stays right in the bottom, doesn't it? Because of centrifugal forces. And I say, the ancients knew about this, and Galileo and Newton knew about this force. But the question is, why don't we go flying off the surface? Because if the force is pushing towards the bottom of the bucket, pushing outwards towards the outside of the circle, and we are on a planet that's moving, and the force should be pushing us towards the outside of the circle, we should all go flying off the planet. Now, once you can get them to grasp that, and you ask them what it is that stops us from leaving the Earth's surface, you'll inevitably get one kid in the class to answer that it's a form of magnetism. But that's a way to open up the idea to them. If you put an ant, for example, on the bottom of that bucket and started swinging it, the ant would be thrown off unless it could hold on. But you get the idea. So that's he makes an extremely interesting and very good point, that there should be a way of teaching kids so that they feel the urgency and importance and the debate of the ideas. You shouldn't just say, well, we all know that we're held on the earth by gravity, and for each action there's an equal and opposite reaction, and inertia prevents movement or resists movement. Instead of that, you should give them all the questions faced by the original scientists in their endeavors. And that way the child will learn, instead of just getting this received opinion and not caring about it, and coming to this sort of indifference to truth, they'll learn it in the marrow of their bones, and they'll understand it. So, good point, thanks for that, Mill. Now, he gives an example that I think is not exact. He talks about the Socratic method and the dialogues of Plato, and he says that this is a sort of a negative way of coming, negative not in the sense of bad or something, but as in every answer that you get, you say, but are we sure about this? Do we know this to be true? Or whatever. Every answer that's suggested, you question it as much as you can. That's no way for kids to learn, of course. The best way for kids to learn it is by using the historical questions that the scientists face, not by just questioning everything that comes into your mind. If you use the Socratic method, you would ask kids, what holds us on the earth? They would say gravity or some form of magnetism. You would say, are you sure about this? Blah, 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 and you'd question them and lead them, show them observations and stuff. But it's much better to give them the historical facts as it developed and what the original people were dealing with when they answered these questions. The Socratic method's not as brilliant a way of doing it as the historical hierarchical method that Lisa Van Dam uses. Now, a standalone sentence. It is far from a frequent accomplishment, even among thinkers, to know both sides. So he says that once in a while somebody knows both sides of an argument, but usually they just know the side that they believe or whatever. Now, that's an odd idea, because objectivism holds that unless you know both sides, you don't know it at all. Unless you have studied the opposite of the opinion that you think you hold, you don't understand the opinion that you hold. Put that in your pocket for later. We skip a little bit. We're on page 56 here. It is the fashion of the present time to disparage negative logic, that which points out weaknesses in theory or errors in practice, without establishing positive truths. Such negative criticism would indeed be poor enough as an ultimate result, but as a means to attaining any positive knowledge or conviction worthy of the name, it cannot be valued too highly. So far, on the opposite side of the idea from saying you shouldn't be criticizing unless you have a theory of your own. He says, far from that. This can't be valued highly enough. People should question and criticize, even if they don't have a theory of their own. Now he says that until this way of thinking changes, until this way of thinking that you can't just criticize and question, you have to come with a positive theory of your own. He says, until this changes, quote, there will be few great thinkers and a low general average of intellect in any but the mathematical and physical departments of speculation. And that's where we are today. We have only the mathematical and physical departments that are effectual at all, and they are corrupt in themselves. They're bad enough, but they're the best departments that there are. And according to him, it's because people aren't trained in the art of simply questioning and being skeptical. They are trained in the idea that you have to have a theory of your own or whatever. It's not even that good in America today. You're just told that your opinion is inviolable and now go to recess. So it's even worse than that. Now here we are on page 58 with a bit about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, scumbag. Let me provide a little taste of what Rousseau's philosophy was for those of you who don't have it fresh to mind. Voltaire wrote a letter to Rousseau, or a publicly published letter to Rousseau, one or the other, and he said, I wish I could do as you say in your writings we should all do, and go and become this type of person that you think is so great, but I can't, because I have for many years been able to walk and speak, and I've completely given off the habit of crawling about and pooping in my pants and stuff. So he equates Rousseau's romanticized ideas with being an infant, a baby, a child. And he says, lovely notion you have there, but I no longer crawl about in diapers and pee in my pants, so I can't go back and be what you suggest we should all be. That's the philosophy of Rousseau, according to Voltaire. Now, according to David Harriman and other objectivists, it is worse than that, if that's possible. It is a romanticizing of nature and a hatred of civilization. It's the idea of the noble savage, and that the Native American Indians, for example, were noble and pure and uncorrupted by the terrible things of civilization. So let's go now with what John Stuart Mill has to say about Rousseau. In the 18th century, when nearly all of the instructed and all those of the uninstructed who were led by them were lost in admiration of what is called civilization and the marvels of modern science and literature and philosophy, and while greatly overrating the amount of unlikeness between the men of the modern world and those of ancient times, indulged the belief that the whole of the difference was in their own favor. So during the 18th century, people looked at the history of mankind, and they believed that they were completely different from any era in history. And, more to the point, they believed that their era was the best, that quote, the unlikeness between the men of modern and ancient times was in their favor. That's reminds me of the peaceniks who hate the idea that we've invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, and they think war is unnecessary. Boneheads that have things like individuals against war slogans on their car and stuff like that. They believe that we have left behind the entire of the history of mankind, and that all we have to do is be nice to each other and everything will be fine. And there was a bit of this going on while everybody was sitting around admiring civilization and science and literature and philosophy, and they thought they were so far ahead of everybody. Quote, with what a salutary shock did the paradoxes of Rousseau explode like bombshells in the midst, dislocating the compact mass of one-sided opinion and forcing its elements to recombine in a better form with additional ingredients. Now right there, he pays a bit of lip service to Rousseau. On the whole, he's, I think, against Rousseau's ideas, but apparently there's some grain of what he likes there. So he says Rousseau came like bombshells, everything exploded and recombobulated with Rousseau's ideas in some of it. Quote, not that the current opinions were on the whole farther from the truth than Rousseau's were. So the current opinions aren't farther from the truth, they're closer to the truth than Rousseau. They contained more of positive truth and very much less error than Rousseau did. Nevertheless, there lay in Rousseau's doctrine, and has floated down the stream of opinion along with it, a considerable amount of exactly those truths which the popular opinion wanted. And these are the deposit which was left behind when the flood subsided. Now, what are those truths that the popular opinion wanted? He doesn't seem to be aware, I'm sure he is aware, he just doesn't mention it, or was aware, that these ideas had echoes way back in Persian poetry and in Egyptian myth and in Greek, of course, Greek, and very much so in Roman poetry and Greek ideas and philosophy and Roman poetry. Rousseau was just resurrecting a long, long tradition of worshiping nature and being suspicious about mankind and everything that humans do. Quote, the superior worth of simplicity of life. That is a self-contained idea. A simple life is better than a complex life. This is an idea of Rousseau's. It's an idea of the Roman poets who praised the bucolic lifestyle, which means a countryside, rural lifestyle. So, the superior worth of a simple life, the enervating and demoralizing effect of the trammels and hypocrisies of artificial society, and ideas which have never been entirely absent from cultivated minds since Rousseau wrote. Now, if he just left those last three words off, ideas which have never been entirely absent from cultivated minds, period, full stop, that's true. Cultivated minds for a long, long time have held farming in the countryside and the nature and so on to be better than the artificialness of city life and so on. They will in time produce their due effect, though at present needing to be asserted as much as ever as to be asserted by deeds, for words on this subject have nearly exhausted their power. So right now, this is mostly ideas. These are mostly just to be talked about and stuff. But in the future, they will have an effect, he says. They will in time produce their due effect. We are today wrestling with the legacy of Rousseau and Kant. Kant more than Rousseau, because if it weren't for Immanuel Kant, the mind never would have been destroyed to the level where Rousseau could take over so thoroughly. So we're really fighting Kant, but Rousseau flavors the modern world, very much so. He flavored John Dewey and John Dewey's friend, what was his name? And we are up against an attitude in the modern world that society and civilization are artificial and unhealthy, and that nature and uncivilization and pre-civilization are preferable. Thank you, Rousseau. Now, this next paragraph, and we're sort of done with the thoughts about Rousseau. So he says Rousseau is bad, but he has one or two interesting thoughts that people like, and in effect, these will, in time, these will have their effect. Then he says, in politics, again, it is almost a commonplace that a party of order or stability and a party of progress or reform are both necessary elements of a healthy state of political life. So that's the Rousseauian idea, that we have our stability in the people who like civilization and education and all the inventions of man, and then there's the party of progress that wants to change things back to a more natural way or back to a more human way instead of all the artificial ways that are going on. Now, that rings very true of the Republican versus Democratic Party today. The Republican Party is called conservative. They want to keep things like they are, go back to the Constitution, reduce government controls like we used to have it, and so on. While the Democrats want to feed and clothe everybody, make sure everybody has medical care. They want to do some sort of progress. So it's the conservative versus the progressive side battling each other. Until one, quote, until one or the other shall have so enlarged its mental grasp as to be a party equally of order and of progress, knowing and distinguishing what is fit to be preserved from what ought to be swept away. Now, if the Republicans could morph into the Libertarian Party of some sort, without the Libertarian zero aggression principle and all the nutcases that they have, if some principled approach to libertarianism could come about, it would be the party that wants to conserve what we had in the past, like the Constitution and our rights, and move forward to what's better in the future, like, for example, the Constitution made slavery legal. We don't want to go back that far, so we're willing to change. But on the other hand, there are things that worked better in the past that we need to preserve, that people fought very hard to create, and we should have a respect for them. If we could do that, we would have a lovely party. I doubt we'll ever see it. Certainly not in my lifetime, I think. It's going to be a hard uphill battle. I was more optimistic about this years ago, but the longer it goes, the more I think that we'll probably see nuclear bombs dropped in the next how many years, and there will probably be a catastrophic war with China, and we might not fight that war with China, but we might. And if we keep on being in bed with Saudi Arabia, and if we don't destroy Iran, then it's going to be like the Cold War against Russia. You know, in World War II, we should have destroyed Russia, but instead we buddied up with them, and it didn't work out. Once the war was over, we had this 50-year Cold War with Russia following up. So that's what we're doing right now with Saudi Arabia. We're in bed with them, and we're thinking that the terrorists are one thing and established states are another, and we're not doing ourselves any favors, just like we didn't with Soviet Russia in World War II. So, skip down a bit here. Truth in the great practical concerns of life is so much a question of the reconciling and combining of opposites. So this is to speak to that idea that politics has to be a little bit of keeping the old plus progressing towards the new. Now that's an idea straight out of Hegel, the way he puts it, that it is combining opposites that it brings truth. That's not true. That's freaking ridiculous. Nor is it combining of truth with untruth that brings a new truth. Nor is it combining two untruths to bring a new truth. No. I could give examples from the history of science where you don't get the new truth of flying, you know, like the Wright brothers and their airplane. They didn't come up with that by reconciling a truth and a falsehood, or two falsehoods, or two truthhoods. No, they got it by figuring out facts of reality, you know. Hegel is tiresome, and it's too bad that Mill is so interested in it. Now, we can skip down a couple pages. The gospel always refers to pre-existing morality and confines its precepts to the particulars in which that morality was to be corrected or superseded by a wider and higher, expressing itself moreover in terms most general, often impossible to be interpreted literally, and possessing rather the impressiveness of poetry or eloquence than the precision of legislation. There we go. There's the gospel in his words, and I think that's brilliant. Possessing the impressiveness of poetry, or the eloquence of poetry, rather than the precision of legislation. And not to be taken literally, but to be taken metaphorically in almost all cases. Of course, there's the do not kill. I think that's supposed to be literal, probably. But whatever, whether it's supposed to be literal or not, I'm not really into the argument there. But I think he hits it right on the nose that the gospel is impressive poetry-wise, but not. There's no precision there for legislation. We can take some comfort or something from some of it, maybe, if that's your thing. I really don't think so. It's a bit embarrassing to me now, the longer I'm an atheist and the more complete my atheism becomes, the more impatient I have become with any reference to religion at all. So, alright, we skip down to the end of this page. Christian morality, so-called, has all the characters of a reaction. It is, in great part, a protest against paganism. Its ideal is negative rather than positive, passive rather than active, right? Turn the other cheek. What's more passive than that? Innocence rather than nobleness, right? Don't do a great thing and be a great person and have values. No. Turn the other cheek. Follow thy Lord thy God. Have faith in the word of wisdom or whatever. Abstinence from evil rather than energetic pursuit of good. What else is a monk except someone who just abstains from being evil and supposedly thereby attains the good? So Mill takes issue with that they just want to abstain from evil, where he thinks that it would be better to desire what's good and try to find it. Of course, if you believe that this earth as such is evil, then the most you can do to be good is to abstain from everything on this earth. That's why it's been called a philosophy of death. In its precepts, as has been said, thou shalt not predominates unduly over thou shalt. There you go. They want to stop you from doing things rather than tell you what you should do or what ought to be done or how should you act is less interesting to Christianity than how you should not act. And it's a philosophy of reaction rather than action. Now, we skip a couple pages. We're on page 65 now. I acknowledge that the tendency of all opinions to become sectarian is not cured by the freest discussion, but is often heightened and exacerbated thereby. The tendency of opinions to become sectarian isn't cured by free discussion, but exacerbated by it. So if you say, well, we want agreement, we want the truth to be spread, we want everyone to be in agreement over what the truth is, and then we'll be able to all get socialized medicine or whatever. We want agreement. He says free discussion makes things even less orderly, even more unruly. There are even more factions. People cut up into smaller and smaller groups. Still, you can't be against free discussion if you take him. So the good thing about freedom isn't that it stops discussion and brings agreement. It's that it allows disagreement. It allows discussion. Quote, not the violent conflict between parts of the truth, but the quiet suppression of half of it is the formidable evil. So he says the problem isn't argument and clash. The problem is shutting one side up. I really like this attitude that he gives here because I guess my argumentative nature has made many people that I've been acquainted with in life have the feeling around me that they really wish that there could be less argument. There's been expressed the opinion that we should just hang out with people that we basically agree with and try to discover truths and stuff on that basis without having to argue and disagree about things. But he says right here that argument and disagreement should be the essence of some of our interaction as humans. Quote, there is always hope when people are forced to listen to both sides. It is when they attend only to one that errors harden into prejudice, and truth ceases to have the effect of truth by being exaggerated into falsehood. Now, if you think you have the truth, then you don't need to listen to the other side. And that's the type of people that say this, that why should we argue? I don't want to hang around with people I disagree with. I only want to talk to people I agree with about things I agree with. How do you discover anything new? How do you learn anything new? How do you get to new truths if you just hang out with people you agree with? And they say it's just the discussion back and forth that allows you to learn new things, but that's just an ignorant view. Truth has no chance unless every opinion which embodies any fraction of the truth not only finds advocates, but is so advocated as to be listened to. Truth has no chance unless you allow every fraction of the truth to be advocated. So to say I never talk to people I disagree with means you're locking yourself out of the potential of finding the truth in things. An very unfortunate attitude. We have now recognized the necessity to the mental well-being of mankind of freedom of opinion and freedom of expression of opinion. Now, he says we've recognized the necessity of that, but he died, and his generation died, and their children died, and somewhere along the way people forgot that. And then they ended up with Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, and then they remembered it. It came glaringly back to mind when the United States conquered half of Europe after World War II, in World War II, but then they forgot it again. Today, you can't speak out against Islam. Absolutely ridiculous situation. People no longer recognize the necessity of freedom of opinion. They say, well, you can have freedom of opinion, but only as long as it doesn't offend. And as I think we were saying earlier in this video series, the freedom of opinion, or freedom of speech, is equal to the freedom to offend. It is equivalent to the right to offend people. Now, we skip to page 69. We're in chapter 3 of individuality as one of the elements of well-being. Now, lest you think he's an anarchist, he talks about here the fact that we have to allow people to say what they want and so on, as long as it is at their own risk or peril. But when it becomes risky or perilous to other people, then even your opinions can be brought into check by law. Quote, "No one pretends that actions should be as free as opinions. On the contrary, even opinions lose their immunity when the circumstances in which they're expressed constitute a positive instigation to some mischievous act." Here's an example. An opinion that corn dealers, people who sell corn, are starvers of the poor, or that private property is robbery, ought to be unmolested when simply circulated through the press, but may justly incur punishment when delivered orally to an excited mob assembled before the house of a corn dealer, or when handed about among the same mob in the form of a placard. So if you're inciting violence, you do not have the protection of freedom. But if you are not inciting violence, you should have every protection, just like your actions. Acts of whatever kind, which, without justifiable cause, do harm to others, maybe justifiable self-defense would be justifiable, for example, but if it's not justifiable and it harms other people, these acts may be controlled by the unfavorable sentiments and, when needful, by active interference of mankind. By the unfavorable sentiments. That means that we can use, like, public ostracism, not the way that the Greeks did it, but just because they actually kicked a guy out of the city. We can ostracize just sort of morally and publicly to make it be known that we don't care for the attitude or actions of this or that person or group. Now, I recently saw some things called "What Would You Do?" done by ABC News, and they had, for example, a sandwich shop somewhere in New Jersey, and they staged this whole thing where the guy behind the counter was an actor, and this Muslim lady comes in and she's an actor, and the guy behind the counter starts saying, "We don't serve people like you here. Do you have a bomb under that hijab? You're a terrorist. We're at war with you people," and so on. And the reaction from the crowd, from citizens coming in and out, some of them were like, "Yeah, go get him, Tiger. She's a scumbag." But some of them got really, really upset. And some of them said, I won't be back to this place. I'm not coming back here." They even did it in a sandwich shop in Israel. They did the same thing. And it wasn't ABC News. It was they're someplace in Israel doing a copycat thing. And it's all, on that particular video, it's all in subtitled captions because they were speaking Israeli or Hebrew or whatever they speak. And there were actually Israelis saying that she's not the one who attacked us. She's not a terrorist. How do you know she's a terrorist? How do you know she's not here legally? Come on. They were getting very upset. And that shop was in effect losing customers. Now, with the ABC News thing, they brought a camera crew out when things got heated, and they said, this is all just a test and so on. So as to defuse the situation. But in principle, people won't support a store or a restaurant or something that has racist or homophobic attitudes or whatever other prejudice it is. We can use something besides the law to enforce some of our ideas on other people. We don't have to use the law with guns and police and jail cells and judges to enforce our ideas. Sometimes we can use just public ostracism. And the business owner has every right in the world to say that people with mohawks can't come in my store, or people with dark skin, or people with light-colored skin. I only serve blacks, That could be said. A person should be able to do that. I know it couldn't in America because we don't have that freedom. But we should have that freedom. And if you don't like that, if you don't like the way that the shop owner is running his shop, you can do everything from just not go there to write a letter to the editor of the local paper, or to, maybe if you're a writer, do a piece on it, write a book, publish an article or an essay on it. Go and stand in front of the guy's place and boycott with a sign. Call all your friends, tell everybody at work not to go there, We can use something besides law sometimes. It's an interesting point he makes. But when we need to use the law to protect individual freedoms, that should definitely be done.